For over 30 years, CNN Bureau Chief Jaime Florcruz has reported on China's most significant events. He is the longest-serving foreign correspondent in China to date. Mr. Florcruz has studied, lived, and worked in China, witnessing its challenges and its achievements. Join us on today's Up Close to hear Jaime Florcruz's view on the Chinese dream. Hello and welcome to the special edition of Up Close. I'm here today with CNN Beijing Bureau Chief Jaime Florcruz. Considered the Dean of Foreign Correspondence in Beijing, Jaime's 40-plus years living in China and 30-plus years reporting from China gives him iconic status as a China expert. Jaime, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us today.
It's good to be with you today.
You've been in China, you've lived in China for 40 years. I mean, that makes you one of just a very small handful of foreigners who I would say really understand and have this very deep connection and bond with this country.
It's understanding kind of in a very personal way. More than just being a journalist here, it's because I've lived through a lot of the changes in China. I've spent months in a farm. I've worked in a fishing boat in Shandong province. And then I've also spent 6 years as a student here.
Right.
At the time when China was in a state of flux. So it's been very exciting living through all these changes.
I'm sure a lot of your viewers, when they see you on the television, they don't know this aspect of you. You know, you're reporting the news, but they don't know this deep intricacy history that you have with China. And of course, China is making news every day, if not every year, if not every week, every month, every day. And CNN is always there.
China is the flavor of the decade in terms of news. China as a beat has become a very coveted beat among foreign journalists. Compared to about 30 years ago when I was just beginning, many foreign journalists want to be here, and it's because China's story has become inherently so important. Whatever the Chinese do, whatever China do or announces to do,
the international media, it affects the world.
It affects the world. It affects the markets. It affects diplomacy and even security sometimes.
Well, this year, of course, China's made big news because of the leadership change. And President Xi Jinping has spoken a lot to the audience, to the world, about, he calls it the 中国梦, that's in Chinese, and translated, that means the Chinese dream. How would you define, after living here for 40 years and reporting about China for 30 years, how would you define what this Chinese dream is?
In my view, I would say it started, in my view, in the 1800s. I studied at Peking University, and during my time, an oft-repeated theme at that time was the youth movement of 1919, the May 4th movement. Beida's spirit, in a way, was shaped by that movement. And I think that was the time when China was also just beginning to enter the so-called modern world. After the end of the ancient Chinese, the imperial China, China was beginning to embrace this new world. And at that time, one of the slogans was, "Welcome Mr. De and Mr. Sai. Welcome Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science." And so I think from then on, at least the intellectuals in China have started to dream of this modern world that maybe China is shaping up to be now. So to me, the Chinese dream is to have a good life, but also to have more freedom, to embrace modern concepts and to be part of this modern world and break out of its diplomatic isolation.
Right. It's very different from the American dream is something that's so defined. You could go onto the internet, onto Wikipedia, and you type in American dream and it'll talk about, hard work means that you can succeed and you can overcome any sort of obstacle. and succeed. The rags to riches story. That is a very individual American dream. How do you see the American dream and perhaps this Chinese dream being different?
I think there are similarities in the way that President Xi Jinping described it or summed it up. It's basically the dream of a beautiful China, where people, he said, would have work to do or jobs, a nice home, and a good life, not just for themselves, but also for the next generation. It's a very pragmatic picture, as I understood it from his two speeches that I was there to listen to.
Right.
So it's in a way it's similar to the U.S. American dream, that basically you want a good life, you want a stable life, and you want a beautiful life. Beautiful now, I think Xi Jinping has defined also as not just economic growth and high GDP, but also blue skies,
which we hope for here in Beijing.
Exactly, drinkable water, but basically a sense of stability
and modernization.
Right. And yeah, not isolation, not just a self-contained society that was conceived of China, decades ago, but a society that's part of this modern world, this global village that we all talk about, and now the Chinese are embracing.
Right. So he's presenting it because we're close. You said this is a dream that's it's been in the works for centuries, right? And evolving. And here's the dream as it presents to us this year. Yeah. What I found interesting, Jaime, is that a lot of Chinese media outlets, when we translate it into English, we're calling it the Chinese dream, whereas a lot of international media outlets have called it China dream. Do you think the nuances between these two terms makes a difference in how it's received?
I think it does, and in my choice would be the Chinese dream, and I choose that because I think it's the people more than the country.
Because people have, I've seen it. People have criticized the China dream. Is it a threat, or is it when they say China dream? Right.
Yeah. So the Chinese dream, I think, goes beyond the nationalism as a nation state. Right. But it's actually a dream of a people, and it's a 1.3 billion people, and obviously it has a lot of room for diversity. It is, people have different interpretation of what is the Chinese dream. It's 1.3 billion dreams, but maybe the point, the commonality, is that it's a very pragmatic, result-driven idea. It's as basic as having, a roof under your head. The Chinese jia, the original character of the jia, pigs with the roof. Right. It's really, and the Chinese speak of anju le ye, right, which is basically to have a house and a good job. I think those, the dreams are coming from those very basic needs or aspirations. But of course, we live in a modern world, so it's more than that. Right. And what to me is inspiring is the fact that it's not just a matter of statistics. It's pragmatic, it's practical, it's tangible. The dream is, a family enjoying a stable, prosperous, and happy life.
Right. So when President Xi Jinping talks about it, he's addressing it. There's the individual level that we've been talking about, but then there's a collective or national level, how to achieve that for each individual.
Right, and that's why I think, in a way, this is a more reachable, more palpable kind of idea. In the past, we've had to deal with translations of the scientific development, or, the three represents. And whenever we start explaining that, it gets lost in translation.
Intangible.
But in this case, I think it does have resonance to most people. And it's kind of a way, you have the Chinese dream, and people have different ways of putting meaning into that. But again, there's also that sense of resonance and commonality.
Right, right. All right, well, when we come back, we're going to hear more from Jaime Florcruz, CNN Beijing Bureau Chief. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Up Close, where I'm speaking with Jaime Florcruz, CNN's Beijing Bureau Chief. Jaime, you've been in Beijing since 1971, and it all started from a student trip that you made back then in the 70s. At that time, you had no idea that you would end up living in Beijing for 40 years. Tell me, over time, when did Beijing finally become what you would consider home?
Yeah, for many months and even years, it was a temporary refuge. It was my, and I really appreciate the hospitality that I've enjoyed all these years. But I suppose it was around 73 or 72 when martial law was finally declared in the Philippines, and there were followed by another round of arrests and blacklisting, that it dawned on me that it's going to be a longer wait to go home.
Right.
And China at that time was very different from what it is today. It was very isolated physically from the outside world, but also it was very isolating even within China from its own people, from the society. I was just beginning to learn Chinese, so there was this sense of isolation and homesickness, and it took a while for me to just decide, okay, this is going to be home for a while.
And you weren't alone. There were a group of students.
There were a group of us.
You were left stranded. You had to stay in China because of the martial law that was imposed.
That's right.
At that time, were you pining to go home?
I was. But in the end, our Philippine passports expired, and we couldn't get it. We were not given a new one until years later. So it was a matter of just facing reality and adapting to that. It turned out to be a blessing in disguise,
right?
Because through all those years after that, I got to learn the language. I got to see China up close, what it was when China was closed off to most foreigners. And I got to have a lot of friends, Chinese friends, who opened their doors to me, their homes to me, at a time when it was not really politically correct to do. And so that helped me overcome homesickness and sense of isolation, and then find meaning in what I was doing at that time. Find that it was actually, I kept telling myself, I'm going to outlive the tyrant at home, and
and you did.
And I did, and I was going to make something out of what was then a adversity.
And you could check that off as well.
I checked that off. But the best part about it really is looking back, just seeing China up close, what it was like. There were very few, I'm told, there were very few foreign journalists who could say, 30 years ago.
How many foreign journalists? Well, that's what's remarkable. A lot of foreign journalists, they'll come in for a couple years, or they, after being on different beats, and they come to China. But you've lived here pretty much all of your adult life.
Yeah.
I don't know how many other foreign journalists can say that they worked on a farm in Henan province, and this was back in 1972.
Right.
Tell me what that experience was like. What did that bring you?
The takeaway from that to me is how poor China was at that time, and I'm sure I was taken to a fairly good, well-run state farm, but even so, it was a Spartan life. A lot of basic necessities were hard to come by, and work was hard because mostly work was by hand.
Labor,
yeah.
Right.
It's really back-breaking work, literally, especially during the busy seasons of harvesting or transplanting rice. I remember, being knee-deep in cold water to transplant the rice in spring, and there would be leeches in the water, and you have to work and stave off the leech on your legs. Having those kind of experience just reminds me all the time. I try to remind myself that first, China is largely a rural country still, even though a lot of, this is 50% now, but at that time it was 70% rural. And I remember always reminding myself that to keep that in mind whenever I did a story or looked at certain things, whether it's high-rise building in Shanghai, the Pudong new district. I always tell myself that yes, this is one aspect of China, but there's still the other aspect, and it's helped me, I think, have a more solid grounding.
Right, and bring it into the overall context of where China is.
Right.
Tell me, you talk about transplanting rice. Next to you were Chinese laborers transplanting rice. How did they view you?
We were considered foreign guests. I mean, they knew we were foreigners. They kind of knew we were, we couldn't go home. So we were kind of a curiosity initially. And of course, by then we had learned some conversational Chinese. The problem was we learned Mandarin. They spoke Hunanese, thick Hunanese accent. So that was a challenge. But to me, another thing that stood out was working with them side by side. The whole idea was to transplant rice from one end of the field to the other. And so basically each of us would take up, 5 or 10 each time. And being so young and stupid, I would take a lot. And side by side with women farmers, and they were doing it, chatting away, just like that. And I was doing it like trying to make it very exact, the exact number of, size of the seedlings.
Right.
And of course, a few minutes later, I noticed I was lagging far behind. And my good comrades, they started to take up part of my quota. So mine was like a triangle in the end. As I moved forward, I was only had to do 2 or 3. And that kind of broke my kind of, male chauvinist kind of idea.
Precision.
And working with the women who are so good, and to them it's nothing. It's a picnic doing it.
Right.
So that was a big shock and a good lesson in sexual equality.
Right. Gender equality.
Gender equality.
Yeah, what sort of dreams did you? We were talking. We just talked about the Chinese dream.
Right.
What sort of dreams did these other workers have? That would they express that to you? And I guess also, what dream at that time personally for you, being young and in China, did you have? What did you dream about?
Well, for them, it was really for the farmers. It's as basic as having better homes and a constant supply of food or coal even. Coal then which we used for heating, it was a luxury for us and for them as well. So all the very basic necessities were dreams, not to speak of consumer goods. I remember that the dream then was 4 things that you could listen to: radio, TV, something else, and then Idong is a bicycle.
Okay.
Right. So those
were the 4 things,
the
necessities,
coveted, coveted things at that time, and that evolved later into something more sophisticated and expensive.
Right.
But during that time, those were the most coveted things, for the basic things. And I remember I was one of the lucky ones because we brought a small kind of a player, a radio recorder player.
Right.
And I was the envy of my neighbors, my Chinese neighbors, because I could listen to the radio and I could play cassette tapes. And I remember one doctor, I think jokingly, telling me, proposing to swap his wife for the radio recorder.
Now that would be a different iteration of the China dream.
Exactly. So, but it kind of shows you that the Chinese were beginning to hear what other countries and other peoples were enjoying, the kind of life. And that especially changed after Deng Xiaoping visited Japan and
the opening up and the
US.
economic reform, right?
Yes, and the Chinese saw on television a glimpse of the lives of other peoples, like the Japanese and the Americans. And I think that was a big shock to them that, wow, they've always thought that China was doing fine.
Right.
But in fact, had been left behind or lagging behind.
Right.
And again, that prompted another series of dreams, or something.
One day we will
aspire to be that.
Right. Right. These are remarkable stories. The insight that you have is incredible. When we come back, we're going to hear more from Jaime Florcruz, CNN Beijing Bureau Chief. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Up Close. Jaime, you are considered the Dean of Foreign Correspondence here in Beijing. You've been here for 40 years. You've reported for international media organizations for over 30 years. It's been an illustrious career, I would have to say. What advice do you give most foreign correspondents who first come to Beijing?
I tell them to keep an open mind, to basically roll with the punches. It's going to be a rough and tumble place if you expect that this will be just another beat like Washington or Tokyo. I also tell them to learn Chinese if they hadn't, as much as they can. I mean, it's a lifetime commitment to learn Chinese, but it helped. And it helped me, and I'm sure it helps them. But more than that, I think it's really just to keep an open mind and challenge yourself.
What I find so interesting about journalism and your own personal work in the last 10 years, maybe, or more in the more recent years, is 10 years ago, 5 years ago, reporting was very objective. There was never really an eye put in it. There wasn't emotion in there. But you have a blog now, Jaimes China, that you do weekly on CNN, and there's a lot of personal story and emotion that you're putting in your reports.
Yeah. Well, I think the idea is by doing so, I think first we highlight the value added that I could offer in pieces like that. Because again, not many of my colleagues could make that flashback or connection to a particular story. Not many, for example, was a classmate of somebody in the news 30 years ago, or not many had interviewed the former Chinese president when he was just the mayor of Shanghai. So I think by putting myself in this story sometimes, I hope to kind of add a layer of context and maybe an emotional touch to what sometimes is just a dry theme.
Right, but it really does help the audience resonate with the story, I think.
And I think by doing so too, I try to kind of tell my audience that it's a glass half full.
Right.
Because if you only compare China now with the other country, with some other countries, it seems like it's a glass empty, half empty. But if I use my 40-year perspective, most of the time it's a glass half full.
Right. You've been a long-time resident of China, and we've been talking about the Chinese dream. So what's your dream for China and for the Chinese people?
My dream for China is that China will keep on growing, and I think it will, growing into perhaps the biggest economy in the world in a few years, and certainly one of the superpowers of the world. But more than that, I dream of China that is self-confident, that is at peace with itself, but also who knows that a lot in the world rests on how China will be and will become. And so I hope that China in the future, my dream is a country that is a positive force in the world for peace, for sustained development, for our global village, that it will grow not at the expense of its own people's life and its own environment, but also not at the expense of the resources and the environment in the world.
Thank you so much, Jaime. I feel like we could talk for hours about this. I mean, there's just so much to learn from you and so much insight to gain. Thank you again for being with us on Up Close.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And thank you to our viewers at home for tuning in. We'll see you next weekend on Up Close. Bye for now.